The river ran broad and steady through the valley, its surface dappled with rippling sunlight that shifted like molten silver with every breeze. To the villagers who lived along its banks, it was both blessing and burden, provider of fish, water, and fertile soil, but also a restless force that demanded constant respect. It was midsummer, and the fields beyond the levee stood green and full, heavy with promise. Wheat bent in the wind like waves, and orchards rustled with fruit nearly ripe. The villagers carried their baskets and tools with the ease of generations who had lived by this rhythm. Women knelt by the water's edge, beating clothes against smooth stones, their chatter rising and falling like birdsong. Children shrieked with laughter as they splashed in the shallows, their bare feet dark with river silt. Fishermen sat with nets stretched between poles, mending the day's tears, pausing now and then to watch the play of sunlight on the current. The levee towered just beyond them, a long, sloping wall of earth and stone built by the hands of their fathers and their fathers' fathers. It was not beautiful, but it was steady, and in its shadow, the village had thrived for decades. To most, it was simply part of the landscape, no different from the hills, the orchards, or the bell tower that marked the village square. Few spared it a thought anymore. Yet the river pressed against it with unceasing weight. The past weeks had brought rain to the mountains upstream, and though here the sky was clear, the current moved with unusual strength. Darker streaks swirled beneath the glittering surface, logs bobbing past more swiftly than usual. Every now and then, a soft slap of water struck the levee's base, a reminder that the wall was not invincible, only enduring as long as it was cared for. But the villagers, lulled by the calm, noticed little. They spread their linens on stones to dry. They set their fishing poles. They filled buckets and carried them home, children trailing behind, dripping and laughing. It was a day like countless others, warm, golden, and deceptively peaceful. Only the river knew the truth. Beneath the murk and swirl, tiny fractures had begun to form in the packed earth of the levee. The rain-fed current probed those weaknesses with patient fingers, pressing, widening, seeping through in threads too fine for human eyes. The wall held, but with each passing hour it weakened. The calm surface masked a pressure building in silence. A hidden danger crouched in the shadow of the sunlit day. And on the far bank, among the reeds and tall grasses, a lone swan drifted. Her white feathers glowed in the sunlight like a scrap of cloud fallen to earth. Her long neck curved with effortless grace. She was a familiar sight to the villagers, often gliding close enough for children to toss crumbs of bread. But today, she did not wander far into the current. Instead, she lingered near the base of the levee, dipping her head into the water, lifting it again, her dark eyes fixed on the shore. The people laughed and worked, blind to the danger. The river flowed, beautiful and treacherous, and the swan watched. The swan was known to all in the village. For years she had made the bend of the river her home, nesting in the reeds each spring, raising her cygnets in the shallow pools, and gliding with serene dignity across the water in every season. Children called her the White Queen, and elders said her presence was a blessing, a sign that the river's spirit favored their people. She was a creature of habit, calm and predictable, as much a fixture of the landscape as the levee itself. But on this summer day, something was wrong. She lingered at the edge of the riverbank instead of drifting into the current. Her webbed feet pressed into the soft mud, leaving deep imprints as she paced back and forth in short, agitated lines. Her wings lifted slightly from her sides, not in the easy grace of preening, but in sharp, restless motions that sent a scatter of droplets shining into the air. Her neck stretched long, then curved back in sudden jerks, as if she could not settle. The villagers noticed, though at first they only laughed. "Look at her, guarding her kingdom," one woman chuckled as she wrung out a sheet. "She waits for bread from the children," another replied. A fisherman squinted toward her, shaking his head. "Strange time for a swan to leave the water. The current's strong, yes, but she's ridden it before." The children, always braver, waded toward her, hands full of crumbs saved from breakfast. But when they drew near, The swan hissed, a sharp hissing note that cut the air like steam from a kettle. She stamped her webbed feet into the mud and spread her wings wide, feathers flaring in a sudden display of warning. The children stopped short, startled. "She never does that," one boy whispered. Their mothers hurried them back, scolding gently, but even they exchanged uneasy looks. The swan's behavior was not playful, not the familiar fuss of a nesting mother. It was agitation, pure and unrelenting. She turned again toward the levee, her dark eyes fixed on its sloping wall of earth and stone, as though it alone held her attention. Step by step she edged closer, lowering her head to the ground as though listening. Then, without warning, she retreated, pacing back to the reeds with a rustle of feathers. Moments later she returned again, repeating the motion in restless loops. To anyone watching closely, it seemed less like the wandering of a bird and more like the watchfulness of a sentinel, guarding, circling, refusing to leave her post. The river glittered harmlessly in the sunlight, and the levee loomed steady and tall. Yet the swan, creature of instinct and water, behaved as though both concealed something more. And though the villagers tried to dismiss it, a ripple of unease spread quietly through their ranks. A bird that should have glided calm and regal on the current, instead, lingered at the edge of the wall that held the river back. And for the first time in memory, her presence seemed less a blessing and more a warning. The morning ripened toward noon, sunlight brightening across the valley, and still the swan would not take to the river. She remained close to the levee, pacing in slow, tight circles along the muddy bank. Each time she neared the water, her head darted downward, beak stabbing at the soil as if testing it, as though she expected it to give way beneath her. Her wings quivered in small spasms, not in the elegant gestures of display, but in movements that betrayed unease. Children, their curiosity stronger than fear, crept closer again. They imitated her gait, laughing at her awkward pacing, flapping their arms like wings. "Look, I am the queen of the river," one boy shouted, stomping through the mud. But their laughter faltered when the swan suddenly snapped her head toward them, her black eyes fierce, her throat vibrating with a low hiss that carried far in the still air. She lunged a single step forward, wings half spread, feathers catching the light in a sudden flare of white. The children scattered back, hearts thumping, and even their mothers, watching from a distance, felt a prickling of unease. "She's never done that," one woman whispered, wringing her hands in her apron. "Not to the little ones." An older fisherman, his hands scarred from nets and rope, leaned on his staff and frowned. "Animals know things we don't," he muttered. "If she won't go into the water, perhaps the water is not to be trusted." The remark was quickly brushed aside with nervous laughter. "It's the current," another man insisted. "It's stronger today, that's all." Yet his voice wavered as he spoke, betraying doubt. The swan hissed again, louder this time, and stamped her webbed feet into the damp soil. Her wings lifted until they arched high, each feather stiff with agitation. She turned her long neck back toward the levee, staring at the wall as though her gaze could pierce its earthen skin. Then, in sudden agitation, she flapped hard, raising a storm of dust and grit, before collapsing back into her restless pacing. Even the elders, who had sat in the shade watching the bustle of the riverside, began to murmur. "In all my years," one old woman said, her voice hushed, "I've never seen her act so. The White Queen does not dance on shore like a goose. She belongs to the water." A silence followed. For the first time, the villagers did not laugh at the swan's strange movements. They watched her more closely, the children clinging to their mother's skirts, the men turning their eyes uneasily toward the levee. The wall still stood, broad and immovable, but something in the swan's agitation pressed at their hearts like a warning too sharp to ignore. The day was bright, the river shone, but a strange restlessness had crept into the air, one carried not by wind or water, but by the desperate movements of a swan that would not leave the shore. By mid-afternoon, the sun beat down on the riverbank, turning the shallows to liquid gold and baking the mud until it cracked beneath bare feet. The villagers had returned to their chores, Women hanging damp linens on lines strung between posts, men hauling baskets of fish from boats, children weaving reeds into crowns, but their eyes strayed again and again to the Swan. She had not stopped. Back and forth she paced, her white feathers dulled with streaks of mud, her movements sharper now, almost frantic. She hissed at anyone who came too near, her cries carrying over the noise of the riverside. When a boy tossed a crust of bread toward her, she ignored it entirely, something no one could remember her ever doing. Her eyes stayed fixed, unwavering, on the base of the levee. At last, one of the farmers, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas, set down the pail he carried and strode closer. "Enough of this," he muttered. "If she means to show us something, then I'll see what it is." He moved to the spot where the Swan lingered, and to his surprise, she did not retreat. Instead, she shuffled sideways, wings half extended, as if guarding the ground itself. Thomas crouched, resting a calloused hand on the earth. Immediately he felt it. The soil was damp, unnaturally so. He pressed his palm deeper, and when he lifted it, dark mud clung wetly to his skin. His brows furrowed. "Strange," he murmured. Then he saw it, a thin, steady trickle of water sliding from the base of the levee, threading its way through the dirt. It was not much, barely enough to darken the soil, but it was enough to make his stomach knot. He brushed the soil aside and found the faintest gap, no wider than a reed stem, where the river's force was bleeding through. The Swan hissed beside him, stamping her feet, her body angled protectively between the seep and the villagers gathering behind him. Her wings arched upward, casting her shadow long across the ground, and her cry echoed sharp and commanding in the afternoon air. Thomas rose slowly, his face grave. "The levee's leaking," he said, his voice carrying more weight than he intended. "The river's found a way through." A murmur swept through the villagers. Mothers pulled children closer, men dropped their tools, eyes darting toward the long stretch of the levee. Most of it still stood strong, but now they all saw the faint dampness at its base, the dark line of soil that spread outward from the tiny seep. What had looked immovable moments before suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable. An elder woman crossed herself. "If there is one crack," she whispered, "there may be others we cannot see." The crowd shifted uneasily. The levee had held for decades. It was the reason the village had grown and prospered on the river's edge. To doubt it was to doubt the very ground beneath their feet. And yet, here was proof, glistening in the sun. The river was pressing through, and beside it stood the Swan, no longer graceful nor serene, but fierce and unyielding, her body planted like a sentinel. She had known before any of them. She had seen what they had not, or perhaps she had felt it in her bones, as creatures of water often did. Thomas straightened, his jaw set. "This isn't something we can ignore. Fetch the rangers. Call the men from the fields. If the wall gives way—" He did not finish the thought. He didn't have to. The villagers scattered into motion, voices rising, feet pounding. Children were herded away, livestock untethered. The air, once full of laughter, now carried urgency and fear. Only the Swan remained still, her black eyes fixed on the crack in the levee, as though she alone understood the full weight of what had been revealed. Thomas's words fell into the summer air like stones breaking water. The effect was instant. Villagers who had been watching in uncertain silence now sprang into motion, their unease hardening into fear. Mothers swept up their children from the shallows, scolding them sharply as they hurried toward the safety of the higher square. Fishermen abandoned their nets where they lay, their hands already reaching for shovels and picks stacked against sheds. Farmers from the fields, hearing the commotion, came jogging down the road with anxious faces, tools slung across their shoulders. The alarm spread faster than fire. The church bell was rung by a trembling boy, its dull clang echoing across the valley. Neighbors poured from their homes, drawn by the sound, their eyes widening when they heard the shouted words, "The levee is leaking!" Within minutes, nearly the entire village had gathered by the river's edge, voices rising in a storm of fear and determination. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide and wet. Old men stood pale and grim, recalling floods from their own childhoods. Young men fetched carts of clay and stones, sweat already running down their brows, though the sun was only just sliding westward. Every face bore the same thought. If the wall failed, their homes, their fields, their very lives would be swept away in a single rush of water. And through the growing chaos, the Swan did not move. She remained at the base of the levee, her white feathers stained with mud, her wings still arched just enough to make her body seem larger, fiercer. She hissed at anyone who drew too close, forcing them to circle around her, as though she herself guarded the crack. Her dark eyes stayed locked on the thin stream of water seeping through the wall, as if her vigilance alone might hold it back. "She knew before any of us," muttered one old fisherman, pausing as he passed with a sack of gravel slung across his shoulder. "That bird, she felt it in her bones." Few disagreed now. Even the skeptical, who only an hour ago had laughed at her strange pacing, now looked at her with a kind of reverence. It was she who had drawn Thomas's attention. Without her agitation, the trickle might have gone unseen until it was too late. The villagers worked frantically. Clay was hauled by the cartload, pressed into the damp earth where water bled through. Stones were jammed into gaps, and timbers were hammered into the wall to brace it against the river's force. Men shouted orders to one another, their voices raw with urgency, while women carried buckets of earth and water to mix the strengthening clay. Even the older children joined in, passing stones from hand to hand. But every so often, eyes flicked back to the Swan. She paced in a tight half-circle, returning again and again to the same damp patch, her wings quivering as though ready to strike. At times, she gave a harsh, rattling hiss that cut through the noise of shovels and hammering, and each time it seemed to redouble the villagers' determination. She was not merely an animal to them now. She was a herald, a sign from the river itself that their wall was in peril. By late afternoon, the levee's base was studded with patches of clay and stone, the weak point shored up as best as human hands could manage in such haste. Still, the river pressed against it with relentless power, the sound of rushing water a constant reminder of the danger that lingered just beyond sight. The villagers worked on, grim and weary, knowing that if they faltered even for an hour, all their labor might be swept away. And always, the Swan remained, sentinel, guardian, restless spirit of the river's edge. Her white form stood stark against the dark wall of the levee, her eyes never wavering, as though she alone refused to believe the danger was past. By late afternoon, the valley air hung heavy with heat and tension. Sweat soaked the villagers' clothes, their hands blistered from shovels and hammers. But still they worked. The levee loomed before them like a wounded giant, patched and braced, its earthen skin darkened with wet clay and streaked with dripping water. For every gap they sealed, it seemed another weakness opened, as if the river itself was determined to prove its might. The river's voice was louder now, a steady roar that carried the weight of unseen floods from the mountains upstream. The surface churned with eddies, tossing broken branches and whole tree limbs against the wall with dull, heavy thuds. Each impact made the villagers flinch. Children watching from the higher ground whimpered as the sound of water crashing against stone rolled through the air like distant thunder. Then, just as hope began to take root that the wall might hold, another cry rang out. "Here! Another seep!" shouted a man at the far end of the levee. A fresh trickle of water oozed through the soil, darkening it like spilled ink. Villagers swarmed to the spot with buckets of clay, shoving their hands into the earth, smearing thick handfuls over the leak. The river resisted. The trickle grew faster for a moment, as though mocking their efforts, before finally slowing under the weight of their patchwork. But there was no time to rest. Minutes later, another shout rose, this time closer, sharper. "It's spreading!" 3 more thin streams appeared along the base, glittering in the low light. Men and women rushed to meet them, voices ragged, arms aching. They worked like people possessed, driven by the knowledge that their fields, their homes, and the lives of their children depended on it. And still the Swan did not move. She remained at her station, her white feathers streaked with mud, her neck stretched tall, wings flicking restlessly. She hissed each time a new crack appeared, her sharp cries cutting through the din of labor like a command. To many, it felt as though she was orchestrating the fight, her instincts guiding them toward danger before they themselves noticed it. Twice, a farmer swore he saw her pacing toward a new weak point, moments before the soil gave way, as if she could sense the river's push from within. The sun sagged lower, painting the river copper and gold, but the villagers' arms did not falter. Timber supports were driven deep, wedges of stone pounded into the wall, cart after cart of clay poured into the bleeding earth. Each time the levee groaned, hearts seized, but each time the wall held, barely. As dusk fell, a silence spread gradually across the riverbank. The villagers stood back, exhausted and trembling, their hands raw, their clothes plastered with mud. The levee still bled in small places, but the worst of the seeping was contained. The wall stood scarred, patched, and groaning under the pressure, but upright still. Only then did the Swan finally retreat a few steps into the shallows. She did not glide away into the current, nor preen her feathers as she often did at day's end. She floated just far enough to ease her weary body, her black eyes fixed still upon the levee, as though refusing to leave until the fight was truly won. The villagers watched her in silence, hearts full of awe and exhaustion. Many crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers of thanks. They knew the river might try again, that their work was not finished. But tonight, at least, their homes were safe. And they knew why they had seen the danger in time. Night settled slowly over the valley, the sky fading from the bruised copper of dusk to a deep, velvety blue. The river's roar softened into its steady, eternal murmur, though the villagers no longer heard it with the same unthinking comfort as before. To them, every rush of water carried the echo of danger, every swell against the levee a reminder of how close they had come to ruin. The villagers gathered on the higher ground, too weary to return to their homes, their bodies caked with mud and their hands blistered raw. They looked down at their work by torchlight, the levee patched in uneven layers, its base lined with clay, stone, and timber. It stood firm now, but it bore the marks of a battle hard won. And in the quiet, their eyes sought the Swan. She floated a short distance from the shore, her white body gleaming ghost-like in the moonlight. The water rippled gently around her, but she did not drift far. Instead, she lingered near the very place she had kept her watch, her dark eyes fixed on the levee as if she still guarded it. Her movements were slow now, her wings tucked close, yet there was something unyielding in her presence, as though she too refused to rest until the danger had passed completely. An elder, her voice hushed and reverent, broke the silence. We would not have seen the crack without her. Others nodded, murmuring in agreement. They recalled the morning when she had hissed at the children, her restless pacing, her refusal to take to the current. What had seemed strange then now appeared unmistakable. She had known. She had sensed the river's betrayal long before human eyes had caught the first thin trickle. Thomas, the farmer who had first touched the damp earth, rose stiffly and pointed toward the Swan. The White Queen gave us her warning. She stood guard when none of us thought to look. The river speaks in many voices, and today it was hers. The words settled deep into the crowd. No one laughed, no one doubted. They had seen too much to dismiss the truth. Mothers pulled their children close and whispered the story into their ears, ensuring they would remember. Old men crossed themselves, bowing their heads toward the bird. Even the younger men, skeptical by nature, kept their gazes fixed on her with quiet awe. At last, the Swan dipped her head into the water, scattering droplets that caught the moonlight like sparks. Then, she glided farther out into the river, her silhouette sleek and unbroken, her body drifting with the current she had denied all day. She moved with the same calm dignity as before, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But for the villagers, everything had changed. In the days and years that followed, they repaired and strengthened the levee, always with an eye toward the spot where the crack had first appeared. And each time they passed the riverbank, they looked for the Swan, Children called her guardian now, not just queen. Stories spread from household to household, growing with every telling: how the swan had refused to leave the shore, how she had hissed and paced until the villagers finally saw the danger, how her vigilance had spared them from disaster. And so she was remembered, not only as a graceful creature of the river, but as a protector, a sentinel in feathers and bone, whose instincts had seen what human eyes had missed. The levee stood, the fields remained, the village endured, and in every telling, beneath every prayer of thanks, the White Queen drifted through memory, forever the swan who saved the village from the river's wrath.